I woke up one night and realized someone had been living in my house for months. I moved into my house in early spring, about 2.5 years ago. It was a small 3-bedroom place on the edge of a quiet neighborhood, the kind of street where neighbors wave at each other but don't really know each other's names. I was 29, newly single after a 4-year relationship ended badly, and I wanted a fresh start. The house was older, built in the 1970s, but it had character. Hardwood floors, a big kitchen, a basement I planned to turn into a home office someday. The landlord told me the previous tenant had moved out of state suddenly, which I thought was a little odd at the time. But the rent was below market rate and the neighborhood felt safe, so I signed the lease without asking too many questions. I should have asked more questions. The first few months were completely normal. I unpacked my things, painted the living room a deep green I'd always wanted, and slowly started to feel like myself again. I worked from home, remote marketing job, so I spent a lot of time in the house. During the day, it felt warm and peaceful. At night, I slept with a white noise machine because the old pipes made strange sounds. I told myself it was just an old house settling. That's what you tell yourself when you don't want to know the truth. Looking back now, the signs were there from the very beginning. I was just too busy, too distracted, too determined to believe my new life was finally going well to notice them. It started with food. I'm a creature of habit. I buy the same groceries every week. I know exactly what I have and what I don't. So when I reached for the peanut butter one morning and it was almost empty, I was confused. I had just bought it 4 days ago. I lived alone. I thought maybe I'd been stress eating without realizing it. I'd been anxious lately. I let it go. Then it was my blanket. I kept a spare blanket folded on the top shelf of my bedroom closet, the kind of thick fleece blanket you only bring out in deep winter. One day in August, I noticed it had been moved, not gone, just shifted, like someone had taken it out and put it back in a hurry. I told myself I must have moved it myself. Maybe I'd been sleepwalking. I'd done that as a kid. The smell was the next thing. Occasionally, usually in the early morning before I was fully awake, I'd catch a faint smell in the house, musty, human, like someone had been sweating in an enclosed space. I checked my trash cans. I checked the bathroom. I assumed it was coming from outside somehow, drifting in through the old window seals. And then there were the sounds, soft ones, barely there. Sometimes at night, I'd wake up and lie completely still, convinced I had heard something move somewhere in the house. A shuffle, a slow, careful creak of the floor. But when I got up to check, there was nothing. No one. The doors were locked. The windows were shut. Everything exactly as I had left it. Eventually, I stopped getting up to check. That was my biggest mistake. It was a Wednesday night in November. I remember because I had been on a work call that ran 3 hours too long, and by the time I finally closed my laptop, I was exhausted and irritable. I made a quick dinner, watched half an episode of something I can't even remember now, and went to bed earlier than usual, around 9:30. I fell asleep almost immediately. I woke up at 2:17 a.m. I know the exact time because I stared at the clock on my nightstand for what felt like a full minute before I understood why I was awake. I hadn't had a bad dream. The pipes hadn't made noise. My white noise machine was still running. Something else had woken me up, and then I heard it. A cough. Soft, muffled, like someone trying very, very hard not to make a sound, and failing, just barely. It came from below me. From the basement, I lay completely still in my bed, my heart hammering so hard I could feel it in my ears. I told myself it was the neighbors. The house next door was close. Maybe sound traveled through the walls. I told myself it was an animal. A raccoon had gotten into the basement somehow. I told myself anything except the thing I somehow already knew. I picked up my phone. My hands were shaking. I almost called 911 right then, but something stopped me. That horrible, irrational human need to be sure before you look like a fool. I typed out a text to my best friend instead. I think someone might be in my basement. Probably nothing, but if you don't hear from me in 10 minutes, call the police. Then I sent it. Then I got out of bed. I don't know why I did that. I genuinely do not know what I was thinking. Every horror movie, every true crime podcast, every piece of rational sense I had ever possessed was screaming at me to stay in my locked bedroom. Instead, I picked up the only thing nearby that felt like a weapon, a heavy metal flashlight I kept on my nightstand, and I walked out into the hallway. The house was completely dark. I moved slowly toward the basement door, which was in the hallway just past the kitchen, and as I got closer, I started to smell it again. That smell, musty and human and close. The basement door was closed, but there was a thin line of light under it. My phone buzzed in my hand. My friend had texted back, "What? Call me right now." I didn't call her. I couldn't make a sound. I stood there in front of that door for what felt like 10 minutes, but was probably 30 seconds, staring at that thin, yellow line of light. Part of my brain was still desperately constructing explanations. Maybe I had left a light on down there and forgotten. Maybe the light had always been there and I'd never noticed. But I had been in that basement dozens of times. I knew I had never left a light on. I reached out, gripped the door handle. I don't know where I found the courage or the stupidity to open it, but I did. The stairs were in front of me, leading down into the basement. The light was coming from the far corner, past the old furnace, from behind a stack of boxes I had never gotten around to unpacking. I stood at the top of the stairs, and I called out in a voice that didn't sound like mine. "Who's there?" Silence. Then movement. Slow, deliberate, like whoever was down there had made a decision. A man stepped out from behind the boxes. He was middle-aged, maybe 50, with a heavy beard and hollow eyes that squinted in the light like he wasn't used to it. He was wearing a gray sweatshirt that I recognized immediately. It was mine. I had assumed I'd lost it months ago. He looked at me. I looked at him. And then he said, quietly, calmly, like this was somehow a reasonable situation, "I was hoping you wouldn't come down." I slammed the door shut, ran back to my bedroom, locked the door, and called 911. I was crying so hard they had to ask me 3 times to repeat my address. The police arrived in under 4 minutes. They found him still in the basement. He didn't run, didn't resist. He sat down on the floor when the officers came down the stairs and put his hands up without being asked, like he'd been waiting for this. His name was Gerald. He was 52. And here is the part that made everything so much worse, so much harder to process. He had been living in my basement for approximately 4 months. 4 months. He had found a way in through a small window on the back side of the house, a window that had a broken latch, which the landlord had apparently known about and never fixed. During the day, when I was working upstairs, Gerald would move around the basement quietly. He had a sleeping bag tucked behind the furnace. He had a small battery-powered lantern, which explained the light I never noticed before, because he usually only used it after I'd gone to sleep. He had been taking small amounts of food from my kitchen, always just enough that he hoped I wouldn't notice. He had been using my laundering to wash his clothes when I was out. The investigators found a journal he'd been keeping down there. He wrote about me in it, what time I woke up, when I left the house, what TV shows I watched, what my routine was. Not in a violent or threatening way, which almost made it more disturbing. He wrote about me like I was a roommate he was quietly observing, like we were living parallel lives in the same house, and he was just being careful not to disturb mine. Gerald, I eventually learned, had lost his job and then his apartment 18 months earlier. He had been unhoused for over a year. My house, with its broken window latch, its large basement, its single tenant who worked from home but kept a predictable schedule, had seemed to him like a safe place. I'm not telling you that to ask you to feel sorry for him. What he did was a profound violation of my safety, my privacy, and my sense of reality. I had months of trauma therapy afterward. I moved out of that house within a week. I slept with the lights on for almost a year. But I am telling you that because it was part of the truth, and the truth was complicated in ways I hadn't expected. Gerald was charged with criminal trespass and breaking and entering. He accepted a plea deal. I was never required to face him in court, which my therapist said was probably good for my recovery. My landlord, after learning that the broken window latch he had never fixed had allowed a stranger to live in his property for 4 months without his tenant's knowledge, faced a civil lawsuit. I won't go into the details, but I will say I no longer pay that particular man any rent. I moved into an apartment on the 4th floor of a building with a doorman, a key fob entry system, and no basement. I checked every window latch myself before signing the lease. I still check them every single night before I go to sleep. The thing that stayed with me the longest, longer than the fear, longer than the anger, was the realization of how long I had been explaining away the signs, the food, the blanket, the smell, the sounds in the night. I had been so committed to believing that my life was fine, that my fresh start was working, that I refused to take seriously the evidence that something was deeply wrong. I think about that a lot. How often do we ignore the thing we don't want to know? And that is the story I heard online, and one I'll never forget. If you're watching this and something about your own space has ever felt off, trust that feeling. Check the window latches. Fix the broken lock you've been ignoring, and tell the people you love where you are. If this story kept you up tonight, you're not alone. Drop a comment below and tell me which part got you the most. And if you have a story of your own, something you heard online, something that happened to a friend, something from a Reddit thread at 3 a.m. that you can't stop thinking about, send it to us. We read everything. Subscribe to Heard It Online. New stories every week. And until next time, sleep with the lights on.